Take Back Your Health Now, Episode 85. Information contained in this podcast is not medical advice. It is for educational and informational purposes only. Please consult with your doctor before making any health choices.
You're listening to the Take Back Your Health Now podcast, the show that interviews the top doctors, athletes, trainers, and entrepreneurs to help you find the holy grail of health. Now here's your host, Dr. Dan Margolin.
This is Dr. Dan Margolin with another segment of Take Back Your Health Now, where we pull out all the stops in search of health's holy grail. Today we have a very interesting topic. We're going to be talking about cancer. We've got Mr. Travis Christofferson, MS, received his undergraduate degree in molecular biology from the Montana State University Honors Program and a master's degree in material engineering and science from the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. Today he is full-time science writer and founder of a cancer charity, Foundation for Metabolic Cancer Therapies. He lives in South Dakota. He also wrote the book, Tripping Over the Truth, The Metabolic Theory of Cancer. Mr. Christofferson, how are you, sir?
Good. Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thank you so much for being on the show. So could you explain to us, well, I guess we'll get into a little bit how you got into this, but what is, in the wording, the metabolic theory of cancer? What does that mean?
Yeah, so simply put, when you say metabolism, all you're talking about is a summation of all the sort of chemical reactions that go on in the body, in the cell. And the main topic people think of when you say metabolism is energy metabolism.
Right.
And so the difference between the sort of dogmatic theory of cancer, which is called the somatic mutation theory, and the metabolic theory of cancer is the somatic mutation theory contends that cancer is driven by specific mutations to key genes. It's a genetic disease. It's pretty much random. It's a cause of bad luck. There's not much we can do about it. The metabolic theory contends that cancer is more driven by damage to these little organelles in the cell, cigar-shaped organelles that generate 90% of the energy in the cell. They're called mitochondria. And the cancer is triggered by that and then driven by sort of an epigenetic change where there's perfectly intact genes. No mutations are necessarily required for cancer to be precipitated.
Now, what does the word epigenetics, what does that mean?
So epigenetics literally mean the root word is on or above genetics, and that describes it very well. So you inherit in your DNA, you have about 20,000 genes, and epigenetics is just how those 20,000 genes get turned on and turned off. And a very easy way to visualize that is a neuron is a cell, which is very different than, say, a liver cell, and those two cells translate different genes. So the genes for the liver function are turned off in the neuron and vice versa. And that is all done through these epigenetic regulation.
Understood. So let's sort of take it back. How did you get into researching cancer? Just take us back to the sort of the fundamental story, and then how did you start writing the book, etc.?
For me, it was just a collision of lots of things. I was doing a class in graduate school on cancer theory. And my undergraduate degree was biochemistry and molecular biology, and I was pre-med. And so I learned what everybody else learned about cancer, about how the genetic components, somatic mutations. And I picked up this book, just happened to click by on the Kindle. If I wouldn't have done that, I never would have written the book. But it was a book called Cancer is a Metabolic Disease by Tom Seyfried. And in that book, it's this beautiful, comprehensive, huge book, written like a textbook, laying out this argument for this metabolic theory of cancer. And I had no idea that there was, over 100 years of research that laid out this theory and made it this very viable, comprehensive theory. So, I've always dabbled in writing, and at that point, it was a really rich story because it goes back to this guy named Otto Warburg, who was sort of chastised, brilliant scientist. And he was the first to propose this metabolic theory, but he was sort of chastised for it later in his career. So it was kind of this scientific redemption story. It had this kind of beautiful narrative arc. So
let me say, Otto Warburg, that goes back to way back, like to Einstein. Is that in the same time period?
Exactly. Yeah. Those guys were operating in the 1920s. And actually, Albert Einstein and Otto Warburg were very good friends. And it's an interesting time. Back then, those guys they were very coveted in Germany and in most of Europe. They didn't have to ask for grant money. They were just sort of showered with these resources.
Really?
Yeah, Otto Warburg, he was widely considered the most brilliant physiologist, biochemist of the day in the early 20th century. And he actually went off and fought, it was in World War I, was fighting on the Russian front. And Einstein wrote him a letter saying, your job could be served by a common man. Your humanity is much better served if you're back here in the laboratory.
Wow.
And convinced him to come back. And then during World War II, he was part Jewish. He would have had to flee, but Hitler was terrified of cancer. His mom had died of cancer. And so he knew that Otto Warburg was the world's, foremost expert in cancer. So he allowed him to stay and kept his laboratory intact.
Oh my God! There's something with the Krebs cycle coming from that laboratory? The research of that is that am I wrong on that or?
No, that's how the rich history of all this. What it was is Hans Krebs. I can't even remember the number of Nobel Prizes that came out of Warburg's lab, but Hans Krebs was a student of Warburg, and Hans Krebs was the one that came up with the Krebs cycle. All that fundamental biochemistry sort of came out of that era.
Right. Okay. I knew that. Now, pulling back some of my classes, I remember some of this information. That is crazy. So when we're talking about Warburg, we're actually talking about somebody that was not well renowned. I mean, so when he's talking about this as a theory, I mean, it definitely has some validity to it.
Yeah. It just, if you look at the sweep of history, you see what happened. Warburg had good evidence for metabolism, and there was others too that show that the metabolism and the cytoplasm, all these epigenetic factors, were very important in cancer. But when you look at the arc of history, what happened was DNA was discovered, and it was known that there was mutations in cancer cells. So everybody focused on that, and that's where all the research went into. And so Warburg's theory and the anything that had to do with the metabolic theory of cancer was sort of swept aside.
Okay.
And it's kind of, obviously it's made this, astounding resurgence as of lately.
Well, it's true. Whenever you see a lot of these cancer institutes advertise on television, they still purport this sort of genetic mutation thing where I've seen where they're targeting your specific genetics. Is that proving not to be true? Is that what you're saying?
So that's exactly right. The era of targeted medicine began really in the 80s, and people thought that we would cure cancer by targeting these genetic lesions within cancer cells. And various drugs have come up that do that. For example, Herceptin is one that targets the HER2 gene in breast cancer. Gleevec targets the Philadelphia chromosome and certain kinds of leukemia. And there's been a few success stories. And now you can debate the reason why they're success stories is you can show that it actually circles back to metabolic functions. So it's not always clear cut that you're targeting the driving force behind cancer in many of these cases. But by and large, these targeted medicines have been a dismal failure. They really haven't moved the needle on cancer death rates. There's a few.
It's just interesting to me though that when you speak to the general public, they're not aware of this yet. Am I wrong? Or it just seems like they're still thinking that cutting edge is going to be the concept of this genetic propensity.
Yeah, and that gets sort of propagated in the media. You hear the next breakthrough of cancer is always around the corner, and you hear targeting it sounds beautiful, targeting genomics, sequencing, and there's a lot of inertia. There's a lot of money behind all these projects, and so it's hard to move the ship. It's like trying to change the direction of the Titanic. But I think the general public has got a good sense that cancer, we haven't made the breakthroughs that were promised, not even close.
Right.
It's still set to pass heart disease as the number one killer in the Western world. And there's been huge strides forward in cardiovascular diseases and most other diseases, while cancer, the death rates have remained very stubborn. So I think, in the back of most people's minds, regardless of what they read in the media, they know that something is not right.
Well, I interviewed, talking about cardiovascular disease, I interviewed Dr. Stephen Gundry. He's the chief cardiovascular surgeon at Loma Linda Hospital. And he, for the most part, stopped doing a lot of the bypass surgeries when he recognized that it was actually a nutritional problem, and that when they changed the diet of these individuals, they were able to reverse, many of these cardiovascular diseases, the plaques and stuff like that. Are you saying that we're finding that really we're sort of going back? It's almost like we are going back to a concept that people knew about many years ago.
Yeah, you're back to the fundamentals, right? And that's going back to nutrition, that you can prevent so many ailments just by having the right nutrition. And cardiovascular disease is a great case of that. And there's a beautiful theory by Bruce Ames called the triage theory. And it kind of explains very well for cardiovascular what you're talking about is vitamin K is involved in blood clotting, but it's also involved in, it's a cofactor in about 15 different enzymes. And so your body the enzymes that represent the most immediate need will take that vitamin out of your bloodstream and use it right away. So blood clotting obviously is an immediate need. So
right.
It'll bind preferentially to vitamin K, where down the list towards the end of the 15 is the enzymes involved in calcium regulation and taking the calcium out of your arteries so it doesn't get deposited, which leads to heart disease. So if you don't have enough vitamin K, it will get used by these immediate enzymes first, and you'll have a low-grade deficiency. You don't know that, but it manifests over years and decades as this arterial calcification, which leads to heart disease. So that simple tool of just topping off your vitamins and minerals in the right ratios is critically important for everything.
Travis, our show is in search of health's holy grail, and we've interviewed so many people now, and I'm really becoming more and more fascinated that no matter what area we're looking at, it's always coming back to nutrition. I mean, it just seems to be like really what I'm finding is the holy grail of health is within that realm. And shockingly, even in cancer now, where I was actually always taught that some of this is genetics, and that's really where the answer is going to lie. I'm just like stunned. Could you go into just any kind of studies that I a little bit in your book, you go over like the studies where I think they took the nucleus out of normal cells and switched them with cancer cell. Could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah. And I'll add one more thing to nutrition. Also, if you have a low-grade deficiency in B vitamins are cofactors for DNA repair enzymes, and DNA damage certainly can trigger cancer. You can argue back and forth about what fundamentally it's doing there, but a deficiency in B vitamins in mice, you'll see all these breakages within the chromosomes. Chromosomes will actually physically break. So that's
what are chromosomes for just the listeners? What are chromosomes?
So chromosomes are just your genetic luggage that you inherit from your parents. You get 23 from your mom, 23 from your dad, and those are where all your genes reside, and that's what makes you you. That's your operating manual.
Gotcha. And so that those can actually be broken up by a lack of nutrition.
Right. Yeah, and so back to your other question, there was a beautiful series of experiments called nuclear transfer experiments that were done in the 80s, and again, largely ignored just because of the time. Everybody was focused on the genes, and they're very, they're simple to understand when you explain them. And all the researchers did was take the nucleus of a cancer cell and transfer it into a normal cell, grow those cells in a petri dish, and then inject them in mice. Now, if cancer was a purely genetic disease caused by genetic mutations, those would all be transferred into this normal cell, and you'd think that you'd have cancer. When you injected in the mice, almost none of the mice got cancer.
Wow.
So then they flipped the experiment. It took the nucleus of a normal cell and put it into a cancer cell with its nucleus removed. So now you have a cancer cell, all the cytoplasmic variables, with its nucleus removed and a normal nucleus in there with no genetic lesions. Again, they grew these cells in a petri dish and injected them in the mice, and over 90% of these mice developed cancer.
Unbelievable. Now, when you're talking about cytoplasm, so you have a nucleus and it's surrounded by cytoplasm. What is in that cytoplasm?
So the cytoplasm is full of all the cellular organelles. You probably most of the listeners probably remember back to high school biology, like the mitochondria, the Golgi apparatus, all these little functional organelles are in the cytoplasm. And we've underestimated the power of the cytoplasm all through history. It's always surprised us how important the cytoplasm is. From the cloning of Dolly, nobody knew that if you took a intact old, from a nucleus from an adult cell and put it into an egg cell, you could clone, you could reset those chromosomes back to time zero and again unfurl this program of embryogenesis and create a life. And that's all driven by these cytoplasmic factors. So all these various things in the cytoplasm, transcription factors, epigenetic modulators, they're wildly important to our health. And they've been underestimated throughout all of our tenure, with science.
So that experiment basically is proving that whatever is going on with cancer, it's in the cytoplasm, it's in the mitochondria, it's in these Golgi apparati. Is that correct?
Very beautiful. It's inescapable conclusion that something in the cytoplasm can drive cancer. It's not just nuclear DNA mutations to DNA. There's something in there driving cancer.
So I see so many theories of cancer. I mean, no matter where you look, everybody's got a different theory, a different concept. This kind of an experiment would tend to me to actually narrow the field a great deal. Has it done that? Has it gotten the attention it deserves?
It is starting to now. It didn't. Again, these were done in 87, 88, and I've interviewed the researchers that did them many times, and they were just befuddled that the NIH committees didn't even fund further research. And the committees were like, these can't be right. This data cannot be right. There's no way that there's cytoplasmic factors that drive cancer. So it just sort of died in the vine. And they were just, again, they were befuddled by their reaction to it. And it would have changed the history of cancer if people would have paid attention. But again,
is it Tom Seyfried that actually brought this back up? Like, how did this come back up to the forefront?
I think Tom is responsible for bringing this back into light. He highlighted all these experiments in his book, and I highlighted them in my book, and now people are talking about them, and they're getting more and more attention. People want to repeat them. I think there is a fundamental shift in the way cancer is being perceived now.
Wow. So let's jump into the mitochondria a little bit. So it does seem that within that cytoplasm, you have the mitochondria, that within there may lie the key to cancer, or the way the mitochondria is functioning versus an anaerobic where it's lacking oxygen versus aerobic function. Could you go over that a little bit?
Yeah. The mitochondria, they're absolutely incredible. And we wouldn't be here without them. They are alone what caused multicellular organisms to evolve. They're absolutely, they have their own DNA, and that's what happened. We were back billions of years ago, we were single bacterial cells, and mitochondria actually were a free living bacteria that came inside of a cell and established themselves. And then over time, they became responsible for generating energy, and they transferred all of their DNA to the nucleus. So there's about 2,000 genes within our 46 chromosomes that are mitochondria that were transferred over time. So there's this constant crosstalk between our genetics, our normal genome, and the mitochondria. And so they're absolutely, astonishingly important to our overall health and biology. They create all of the energy that, with minute to minute, we require the energy that they create. And so there's a real focus on just maintaining mitochondrial health. And the predominant theory of aging is called the mitochondrial theory, that contends that as mitochondria sort of become less functional as we age, that's what causes our overall decline. So the big push is, how do you maintain mitochondrial health? And now, there's various ways to do that. Fasting has come forth as a very good way to restore mitochondria. There's this process called autophagy, where defunct mitochondrial proteins and even whole mitochondria will be digested by the cell, and then new mitochondria will be take their place.
Now, you would say that so fasting actually increases this cycle?
It does, yes. It causes, it digests all the sort of defunct proteins and even the whole mitochondria. And so you'll get this sort of rejuvenating, these new mitochondria will take their place. So it's a very rejuvenating thing with regard to mitochondria.
Wow. Wow. Now, with mitochondria, when you look at a cancer cell, how does the mitochondria there differ from that of a healthy cell?
Yeah, lots of debate in that contentious debate. So just in general, when you look at the mitochondria of a cancer cell under an electron microscope or analyze their lipid profiles, they're very distorted. They're shaped differently. Their lipids are all broken. Their proteins aren't expressed right. There's less of them. Typically in the more metastatic, aggressive tumors, there's about 50% of the normal content of mitochondria than you see in a normal healthy cell.
Wow.
So cancer cells will shift from this aerobic metabolism. Mitochondria make energy with oxygen, so it's called aerobically. And cancer cells will shift away from that and generate energy anaerobically and sort of bypass the mitochondria. So there's tons of debate why this is going on. Are the mitochondria actually damaged, or does the cancer cell sort of pivot away from them and then they become damaged? That's all being sorted out. But there's no doubt that the cancer cell has shifted from mitochondrial metabolism. And if you can restore that, it's been shown that if you can restore that metabolism in cancer cells, you can sort of dialogue the cancer cells into behaving normally, doing the right thing, which is something called apoptosis, committing cell suicide, and the cancer cells will kill themselves.
Huh.
So there's the way to do that, the low-hanging fruit is this thing called the ketogenic diet, combined with hyperbaric oxygen as being a sort of a powerful tool to try to restore that metabolism.
What is the ketogenic diet? Like, what exactly would you eat in a diet like that, and how would that work?
Yeah, it's an old diet. It's been around since the 20s. It was actually standard of care for epilepsy back in the 20s. And it's a remarkable diet. What it is, it's maintaining the fasting state through dietary manipulation. So nutritional ketosis is just shifting away from carbohydrates. So you eat almost no carbohydrates, very few, and towards fat. And when you consume fat and there's no carbohydrates to burn, your body's forced to make these molecules called ketone bodies to replace circulating glucose. And these molecules have extremely interesting properties. They burn a lot with more thermodynamic energy, so they create more energy within the cell. And they also have all these interesting epigenetic properties where they sort of even change the architecture of how genes are expressed. So there's tons of research in the ketogenic diet for lots of different disease process, including neurodegeneration, brain trauma, Alzheimer's, and cancer, of course.
Wow. So you would avoid all carbohydrates. Where would you get the fats from? Like, what would be the best source of that?
And there's a lot of debate in that, which fats are the most healthy. I think there's still a lot of people say the debate's over, saturated fats are fine. But in general, you want to stay with quality fats, grass-fed meats, grass-fed butters, olive oils, things like that. You don't stay away from seed oils and things like that are highly inflammatory. You want to shift the ratio of omega-3s to omega-6s from typical Western diets, about 26 omega-6s to 1 omega-3.
Wow.
You want to shift it to about 1 to 1.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. And omega-3 would be found in what would you find that in?
Omega-3 is in, of course, it's in fish, and you can supplement with fish oil. But if you have grass-fed beef, you shift the omega-3 profile gets much higher in grass-fed meats as opposed to regular grain-fed meats. So that just doing that alone, and then staying away from seed oils, which are very heavy in omega-6s, you'll start to change and that's a classic of, there isn't anything more true than you are what you eat, especially with fats, because your cell membranes will be made up of those fats. And when they're made up of omega-3s, you change the way the immune system operates. All of a sudden, when omega-3s get converted into these cytokines and prostaglandins, they affect the way the immune system functions, and it turns down all these inflammatory responses.
Wow. So really everything is starting to shift over to the ketogenic diet and the hyperbaric oxygen. Now, again, that's because the mitochondria or the cells function better in an aerobic environment, and the cancer cells function better in an anaerobic environment where they're lacking that oxygen.
Exactly right. And ketones have to be burned aerobically. That's the thing about them. Carbohydrates can be burned anaerobically. And so when you look at a cancer cell, for example, just imagine a PET scan, which is how you image cancer. And the way you do a PET scan is you inject the patient with radio-labeled glucose, sugar. And the cancer cells will preferentially just take up that sugar because they're voraciously burning that, that blood sugar anaerobically. And so when you shift to ketone metabolism, they cannot be burned anaerobically. They have to be burned aerobically. So you're starving the cancer cells of the fuel that they prefer.
Wow, Travis Christofferson, this is fascinating. This is really, I really love about this is that you really are validating a lot of things that you see in sort of the alternative world of cancer therapies. When you speak to people that for years have been touting this, you know what I mean? Like I've spoken with many people. I've spoken with G. Edward Griffin about Laetrile, vitamin B17. I've spoken with other people about even the acidity of your blood, like keeping your blood more basic. Is there anything regarding that you could speak to?
Honestly, I have not, the pH, the acidity of the blood, I have not looked into that enough to know. And I have some, all those things change. For example, the acids in our digestive system are actually critical for butyrate, making the right molecules in our digestive system. So, and our blood is well buffered. So I can't speak to the general acidification of the body and what that means.
Well, let me ask you, if you're looking at, if people that are listening to this are looking at preventing cancer or to have some sort of a diagnosis with cancer, speak to them. What would be ways that they could, best protect themselves?
Yeah. Prevention, I think it's very well, we can say with confidence that prevention, if you just avoid a bad diet that's high in cheap carbohydrates and sugar, you're going to go a long way to prevent cancer. And again, top off your vitamins. You eat the right micronutrients. So you just eat real food is critical. And we know this because type 2 diabetes and obesity is associated with higher rates of cancer. And you can see this on a cellular level. When you feed a cell too much sugar, it begins shifting the genetic expression towards this cancerous phenotype. So that's kind of the low-hanging fruit that you can tell people with regard to prevention. And again, this lost sort of, knowledge of fasting that so many cultures have done throughout history is, again, making this kind of resurgence as a sort of renewal thing that we can do as far as prevention for many disease processes.
Can they say, as far as fasting, are you better off doing short bursts of fasting or over a longer period of time? Any research in that area?
Yeah, and again, there's debate back and forth, and I would leave that to the science. What's going to work best, I do not know at this time, but most people can pull off a day or a 2-day fast pretty easily, safely.
Sure.
So that's a good place to start. Longer ones, I'm not so sure. I don't know. I haven't looked into the data on real long fasts and if it's got some danger involved or not. But
so let me ask, just in terms of cancer in the general public, is it increasing?
Cancer diagnoses are increasing. We have made some strides, and this is what happened during the 80s. 70s and 80s, we did make big strides in cancer with combinational chemotherapy. We knocked off Hodgkin's disease, testicular disease. We were making big strides in treating cancer at that point. However, it was completely counterbalanced by new diagnoses. So we made our world more carcinogenic during those decades. People were getting cancer at higher rates, whether it was chemicals or diet, we don't know for sure, but yes, cancer diagnoses are increased. We've gotten better at treating it. Again, diagnoses is getting better, but those tend to be offset by more in earlier diagnoses. Yeah.
Unbelievable. So the environmental factors clearly have affected people in this area.
Yeah. Diet, environmental, things in our food and water, all those things. Yes.
Mr. Christofferson, so towards the end of the show, we our whole goal is to sort of search for the holy grail of health. If I were to pose to you the question, what do you consider to be the holy grail of health? What would that be, sir?
Oh man, I would,
put you on the spot here.
The most bang for your buck for the general masses, you have to go back to just this low hanging fruit of pay attention to what you eat. because nature provides you with everything you need, all these, the polyphenols, the vitamins and minerals in the exact right ratios. And when you tinker with those ratios, especially with minerals, you're doing yourself a huge disservice because you're distorting the way the enzymes are operating. So just, and I'm not anti-supplement if you do it right, but be careful with supplements, especially minerals, and just eat good food and study after study and fiber. Pay attention to your microbiome. Study after study has shown this is the best way to mitigate, a host of disease processes.
Awesome. Travis Christofferson, how would people that want to learn more about you, read your book, how would they find out about you, sir?
I have a foundation called the Foundation for Metabolic Cancer Therapies. It's doing some interesting work. It has got a website. Have a new book coming out probably in about 6 months on epigenetics. So yeah, on that, I'll keep you posted on the foundation's website.
Awesome. And what a powerful interview. Travis, thank you so much for joining us, sir. Really appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks, Dan.
This episode is sponsored by New Jersey Foot and Ankle Center in Orodo, New Jersey. Remember, when you have a foot problem, you've got a foot doctor in the family. Weekend and evening appointments are available. Call us at 201-261-9445. Once again, that's 201-261-9445. Thanks for listening. Check out the show notes over at drdanspeaks.com. If you're loving the show, head over to iTunes and leave us a review, and we'll catch you next time.